All right, welcome back to the Nexus podcast. We are here live in San Francisco at RSA Conference. My guest is Charles Blauner. Charles is the operating partner and CISO in residence at Team8, a global venture capital investment firm. One of their focus areas are early-stage cybersecurity companies, and Charles has got a lot of great perspective on the CISO role, and that's what we're going to talk about today, some of the enhanced pressures and other challenges that folks sitting in those seats are dealing with. So good to meet you, Charles. Thank you for doing this.
It's a pleasure, Mike.
This, I'm sure, is not your first RSA conference.
No, my first RSA conference was somewhere, memory, I think 1998. 97, wow. Somewhere in that range.
Yeah, this is probably like 22 for me, so seen a lot. So tell listeners a little bit about your role at Team8 and what you guys are all about.
Sure. So my role at Team8, like you said, I'm the operating partner and the CISO in residence, and that primarily means in a lot of ways that I'm the voice of the customer to all the companies that we're creating. I also run the advisory board to help guide us in how we think about our investment thesis and the like. But it may also help people to understand from a background perspective that when I talk about being the voice of the customer, that doesn't come from a theoretical perspective, because I first became an actual CISO in 1997. I was the CISO of JP Morgan. I was the CISO of Deutsche Bank in the 2000s, and I spent 13 years at Citi. And I was always one of the biggest earliest buyers of cutting-edge technology. Sure. And I actually met Team8 first in 2014, just as they were being formed, and I was building an innovation lab in Tel Aviv. Mm-hmm. And what Team8 is really about is thinking about and searching out really hard problems, and then putting together a theory about whether we can build a leadership team and build a technical approach to solving those problems. And then we literally incubate and grow companies from scratch. And we also today now have traditional VC where we do seed and A round investments. And most recently we've also branched out into fintech and this last year health tech.
Important areas. So from an investor perspective, what's exciting you out there in terms of new ideas, new technologies? I mean, I wouldn't expect you to name names, but...
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure there always really are new ideas. I was actually having this conversation with a person who'd been at RSAs for a long time, like I had yesterday, and we've actually come to the conclusion that we're really just solving the same problems over and over again, just in different technology platforms. If you go back to the 1970s, the two security problems we were trying to solve were patch management and identity management. Today is 3 decades later, and if you ask people what are two of the most untractable problems we're dealing with, it's vulnerability management and patch management. But the tech stacks are different. We're not talking about mainframes. We're now talking about the cloud. We're now much more focused on OT environments because of the realization of how critical they are to the health of companies and obviously to the health of countries. And so what I find really interesting right now is there is a lot of focus on, are there ways for AI to make solving some of the more traditional problems simpler?
Right.
Most people today are really just sort of gluing AI on top of things, and that I don't think is doing much. But I do think there's the potential for AI to really change fundamentally how we think about the problems, and that will be interesting. In the cyberspace, we also have to be thinking about things like quantum computing and how that is going to change the environment. And so those are sort of two areas that I'm sort of keeping my eye on right now.
Was there a trigger for this enhanced attention, this enhanced focus on OT? Was there an event or series of events?
I think the trigger has really been, to some degree, the growth of ransomware attacks. Because ransomware attacks are different in that in a lot of ways, the bad guys don't really care about the kind of company.
Right.
And they don't really care about what they are disrupting. They just want to be disruptive and get money for it. Before ransomware, bad guys didn't really care too much about OT as a criminal thing because there was no way to monetize it. All right. You would go after a bank because you wanted to steal money or steal information.
Sure.
You might go after a healthcare company for secrets and the like. But why would you go after a manufacturing company? There was no way to make money.
Right.
With ransomware, you now have a way for the criminal to attack manufacturing companies, have a way to get profit, and that exposes OT networks.
Right.
And obviously, at a bank, you don't really care much about OT because it's just running your data center. But if your company makes aluminum cans, or if your company makes rubber tires or roofing shingles, their whole existence is based on OT.
Sure.
And a disruption to their ability to manufacture goes directly to their bottom line. Mm-hmm. And now that means, okay, OT security isn't a theoretical thing anymore. It's a bottom line business impacting thing.
Mm-hmm. And there's obviously that impact on public safety or patient safety in healthcare.
Yeah,
that's a completely new dimension to this.
Yeah, and despite how governments talk about sort of red lines, you won't go over this. I mean, governments also don't have a way to inflict any pain on the bad guys, generally speaking, and so the idea of red lines is sort of interesting. It's a political idea. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it becomes a lot of a different conversation if you're talking about a hospital system and you're talking about lives at stake. When I was worrying about the security of the bank, it was a big, scary job, but what was at risk was money.
Sure.
If something bad happened at the bank, no one was going to die. If something bad happens at a hospital, if something bad happens at a gas pipeline, people's lives are impacted. And safety and security, while related, are in fact different. And safety requires you to think in a much more absolute term. Mm-hmm. Security allows you to sort of manage risk. And safety, there's no risk management. It's more black and white.
Right. And that's kind of where the IT-OT collision happens, right?
That's exactly where the IT-OT collision happens. It also happens in a lot of companies because in a lot of manufacturing environments especially, the OT environments were sort of viewed as the domains of the plant managers. And the CIO, who traditionally worried about IT, just did all the back office stuff.
Sure.
And those plant managers, rightfully, are sort of little kings or queens running those environments. And so they had a very different way of thinking about it. But as more and more OT gets connected to IT, whether it's for scheduling or other purposes, those little islands that the plant managers owned weren't islands anymore.
Right.
And companies are slowly coming to the realization that you have to think of it as one problem, how to keep the company running. And
are the CISOs kind of the mediators in that, or part of the problem? Not part of the problem, but part of the process?
Well, CISOs are certainly part of the process.
Yeah.
And I think in the trend I've seen is that in more and more companies, the CISO, if they had not been before accountable for OT security, is becoming accountable for OT security. But just like in anything a CISO is accountable for, it's always a partnership. All right. If a CISO is only focused on IT security, the truth is they still do most of their work through the app dev teams, the infrastructure owners. It's no different now in the OT world where they'll do their work through the factory plant teams, but you have to have those partnerships. You have to have a comprehensive strategy. And so that's really where the CISO will be, that strategy setting role, that partnership driving role. That's where the CISO will be centered.
Yeah. So I know at the outset we said we're going to talk about the kind of the state of the CISO as a role. How would you characterize it today? Because there's so many different pressures. If you're at a public company, you've got to deal with the SEC, cyber rules, personal liabilities entered into this equation as well. Just from your experience talking to different leaders, what are you hearing?
Well, the CISO role's evolved a lot. I mean, the CISO role, you have to also think about, is relatively new.
Sure.
Right. The first CISO was Steve Katz in 1995. All right. The role isn't even 40 years old yet. All right.
Right.
CFOs have been around for a long time. They know what they're supposed to do.
Sure.
We're still figuring it out. What I'd say when I talk to a lot of sitting CISOs is there is a ton of concern about the change of the sort of personal risk equation. All right. CISOs, I think, were always used to the idea that if a breach was going to happen, they would be a scapegoat, they would get fired, maybe a CIO would come along with them, but that was part of the equation, and you sort of accepted that.
Sure.
Because you just figured, I'll go on to my next role afterwards. But now, it's not just about getting fired. Now it's about getting prosecuted. Now it's about bankrupting your family. Now it's about potential for jail or career-ending rulings coming down. If you take a look at the SolarWinds case, if the SEC has his way, Tim is no longer going to be allowed to be an officer of any company.
Right.
Which basically means that Tim would no longer be allowed to be a CISO. That's insane.
Right.
All right. The world desperately needs good CISOs. And I think the SEC, in an unintended way, is potentially discouraging that from happening. The SEC's intentions are actually quite good. All right. The SEC wants the safety and soundness of companies. They want the same things as CISOs.
Yeah.
They just don't have good tools available to them. Mm-hmm. And so they're using 100-year-old tools in a very blunt way to try to influence things. And so, yeah, CISOs are scared.
Right.
CISOs are wondering, do they have to be more confrontational? Do they have to be more cover their ass and write everything down? Time will tell. I actually did a session at the conference on Monday morning called CISOs Under Indictment with David Cross and Joe Sullivan.
Uh-huh.
And we got asked the question by someone in the audience about, should I become a CISO? And all of us would say absolutely yes. All right, we desperately need good, smart people to become CISOs. But what I also responded was, be cautious. When you're interviewing for a CISO job, as much as they're interviewing you, you should be interviewing them and getting a sense of the company's culture and governance. Because in the end, if a company has good culture and good governance, a CISO has the chance to be successful. And a CISO also is not likely to become the scapegoat from an SEC inquisition or state attorney general's inquisitions.
Right.
If a company doesn't have good culture and it doesn't have good governance, no matter how good the CISO is, they're going to fail. And so what I would just urge is go for those CISO jobs, but be picky about the companies that you're going to work with, because it's a lot more dangerous to make a bad choice today.
Sure. I mean, it almost kind of begs the question. You're a CISO and there's a breach, an incident of some kind. How distracted are you in terms of covering your own ass, as you said, as opposed to kind of putting 100% into response, remediation, recovery, etc.?
That's hard to say.
Yeah.
I think if you are a good CISO, you're focused on the job.
Right.
All right. You're not focused on covering your own ass. My assumption always was that if I do the right things, everything else will sort of take care of itself. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's completely the case right now, because I'm not sure the SEC understands what the right things are or aren't. And there's necessarily any clarity for CISOs about right and wrong.
Yeah.
Especially with the new SEC rules around disclosure. No one really knows. They said, if it's a material event, you have to disclose it. Well, how do you want to define material? It's all in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
And the fear right now is because of that, you may make a good choice, or you may not. And if you don't, even if it was a completely innocent bad choice, you may still have yourself in hot water with a regulator or with the government.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard.
Yeah. I mean, that was kind of the first obvious question when these rules came out. It's like, what is material? What does that mean? And, do CISOs now have to kind of, or companies have to invest in a securities attorney, for example? Or
Well, so I think one thing that he sort of indirectly touched on is the CISO shouldn't answer the question.
Okay.
All right. The CISO should gather all the data about the event, and a combination of the head of the business, whether it's a CEO, president, whatever title you want to use, and the general counsel should be making a decision about materiality. All right. There's some aspects of materiality that are more black and white. All right. If you're a publicly traded company, for example, you have a financial auditor. All right. And they do a Sarbanes-Oxley audit every year.
Mm-hmm.
That auditor has defined for every company a materiality threshold around financial losses, so that when a company has a loss, whether or not they have to report it. And so every company has in the back of its head a number where it's financially material.
Okay.
All right. But how do you measure the materiality of reputational impact? Or
Right.
how do you measure the impact of materiality on potentially customer data and privacy issues? And so it's a very multi-dimensional thing. There's only one place, money, where it's more black and white. But that's why people don't really know. And the other thing that really scares people is you don't usually know when the incident happened what's been touched.
Mm-hmm.
So day one, you may look at the incident and say, this was not material. But in fact, after 2 weeks of investigation, you may make a determination that,
Right.
it was. And you then declare it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, am I going to get in trouble for the 2 weeks I took? The SEC has said no, but until we actually see
Remains to be seen. Yeah.
in practice, who knows?
Yeah, that's why when you hear these 72-hour windows to report an incident or whatever, that's not a lot of time to get a true picture of what's happening.
Yeah, it isn't. And I think that's why there's been a lot of questioning to the SEC about when does the clock start?
Yeah.
All right. 72 hours, yeah, I get that. I can measure that. But I don't know when to start the timer.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Because is it when the alert goes off in my SOC? Or is it when I make a determination that customer data has been impacted? Or
Sure.
I mean, I think if you made a determination that customer data has been impacted, the clock should be starting. But
Yeah.
when does the clock start?
Yeah, I did a podcast a few months ago with an attorney who specializes in cyber, and that was her point. It's like, just be careful. You can declare an incident too early, for example.
Absolutely.
And that was a fascinating part of the conversation that we had.
And especially because it's also still very sort of fuzzy in what a good filing looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's watching every filing that's going in now, trying to build a view of what good is going to look like.
Right. Those filings are gold, by the way. Some of them that have come out so far.
It's
for better or worse. I
for better,
suppose.
for better or for worse. And I think it'll take us a couple of years, honestly, to get to a sense of what best practice really looks like.
Yeah.
And the difficult part is during that teething period, people will make innocent mistakes.
Sure.
And hopefully the SEC will view innocent mistakes as just that.
Mm-hmm.
And not take a view that an innocent mistake was in fact fraud.
Sure. Do you anticipate any kind of exodus from this role in any kind of significant numbers, or how do we avoid that?
I do think there's going to be a bit of an exodus.
Yeah.
Especially in, and this is where it's dangerous, especially amongst the best, most experienced CISOs, all right, who might be saying, you know what, I thought I had another 10 years, but do I really want to put everything I've done in the last 20 years at risk during the next 10 years with all this uncertainty? Maybe this is a good time to step away. And so I think we're losing, or we're at risk of losing a lot of the industry's best thought leaders, as far as being operational CISOs. In some weird ways, it's a little bit like Congress, all right? When you get to a certain level of dysfunctionality, the people that are the best stop wanting to actually do it.
Sure.
And it worries me that the people that are the best CISOs are going to all step into venture capital or advisory or other things where they're not putting themselves personally at risk anymore. And without that sort of generation of CISOs still active, who's there to bring up the next generations? It's like if you had a pack of animals and you took out one generation,
right?
Each generation learns from the previous one.
Right.
If you take out a generation, you impede the learning of all the next ones.
It's a significant gap, yeah.
So I worry about losing smart people, and I worry about that also impeding the growth of people that are still interested in, are still in the profession and earlier on in their career growth.
Should CISOs be negotiating differently when they're interviewing or renegotiating for new contracts?
If CISOs don't have, and all around the world the terms are different.
Sure.
If CISOs don't have the equivalent of what here we call directors and officers insurance, I would go talk to my boss or the CFO or whoever and say, just like you, I need it. One thing that's also a very important subtlety here, it's not just about being a CISO, right? If you take a look at SolarWinds, Tim Brown was not the CISO of SolarWinds at the time of the breach. SolarWinds didn't have a CISO.
Okay.
Tim was the most senior security person. And so, irrespective of the title, the SEC is going to treat whoever the most security person is as the accountable person, like a CISO, irrespective of their title and irrespective of their placement in the organization. So irrespective of your title and your placement in the organization, if you're accountable for security, you should be talking to management about things like D&O insurance.
Yeah.
You should make sure that it allows for you to have your own individual attorney. All right. Sometimes D&O insurance says you get covered and the company's attorney will take care of you. Well, if you and the company are well aligned, maybe that's not so bad.
Right.
If you and the company are not so well aligned, you want your own attorney. It's also important that when you're negotiating, that coverage lasts for 3 to 4 years post your departure from the company, because the SEC may go back in history and investigate something and say, hey, I know you left 2 years ago, but, and all of a sudden you're in the middle of it.
Right.
And I also don't think people understand how expensive this is. I'm fortunate. I've never been through it. A few months ago, I interviewed Tim Brown as he was talking about SolarWinds, and Joe Sullivan's also talked about this very publicly. It is millions of dollars to defend yourself. All right. And if you don't have D&O insurance, I don't know a whole lot of people who've just got millions of dollars around who have been CISOs that are where that's not going to really destroy them and their future. And so I don't think people realize just how expensive it is, even if you never even go to a trial.
Right.
I mean, it can cost you millions of dollars just before the trial even begins.
Yeah. And I mean, excuse me, there's a lot of assumptions they shouldn't make, whether they're covered by corporate counsel. I mean, that's not your lawyer, it's the company lawyer. Cybersecurity insurance, does it trickle over to the CISO role? And that's not always the case.
Yeah, and the other thing is the CISO has got to nowadays, let's put the negotiation piece aside, from a contract, the CISO also has to negotiate their involvement in processes that they may not have been involved before. All right. So, like, the CISO may never, if you're a public company, the CISO may never have been involved in the 10K filings. All right. They better be now.
Yeah.
You better insert yourself now to make sure no one's saying anything that can come back and haunt you.
Right.
The CISO has to get involved with corporate communications now, because the CEO might give a speech and say something that is implying a certain state of security that may or may not be true. All right. And that speech can be used against the company. And so it's not just things like these formal filings, but it's all the public statements that a company makes.
Right.
And I don't know too many CISOs who've been that connected into corporate communications, into their general counsels, into their CFOs. And so you need to negotiate a contract, but you also need to negotiate your place in those processes.
This is complicated.
This CISO's job has always been complicated. This just makes it a little bit more.
Just to switch a little bit from a tactical perspective, what specifically do you think CISOs should be taking a harder look at from either a tech perspective or people, process?
I think the most important thing is for CISOs to really take a close look at, if they have to think of something as a starting point, is the overall governance process. All right. So, for example, you think in the SEC case against SolarWinds, they made references to their risk acceptances. All right. Risk acceptances are a standard part of how companies work. All right. But they can be done poorly, where there's no real view of how much risk, there's no view of what the business impact is, the decisions are being made in arbitrary ways, maybe well documented, maybe not. With that kind of bad governance, you put yourself into a lot of jeopardy. So having good governance, how do you identify risks? How do you classify them? Who has the authority to make decisions on what risks you will live with and what you don't? And then how do you track those over time? That kind of good governance is the most fundamental thing a CISO needs to have in place. All right. What comes next, honestly, depends on the size of the organization. And like for me, I was in a very large organization, I had over 2,000 people working for me. Outside of governance, the most important thing was making sure I had the best management team possible.
Right.
In some smaller organizations, the CISO is there with 3 other people. And what the CISO needs to be thinking about and focused on is really maybe much more hands-on. And so there's a lot of variability. But they all should have good governance.
Yeah. All right. So, as a last question, a last thought, if we have this discussion a year from now, how much different do you imagine it being, if at all?
Unfortunately, I don't think things will move a lot in a year. The things that need to happen are really around definitions agreed between private sector and the public sector on things like what does good look like. All right. And that's a long, complicated process. We'll continue to work with NIST and other entities on some of that. But at some point, at least from a U.S. perspective, I do think federal regulation is going to be necessary to at least empower some agency somewhere to have oversight of this topic.
Sure.
The problem today is the SEC is sort of asked to oversee it, but the only authorities they have are around disclosures and transparency and the like.
Yeah.
And so I think it's going to be a journey of time before we get to a place where we've got good agreed definitions to give CISOs more certainty.
Mm-hmm. Interesting times, right?
Interesting times. CISOs have always lived with uncertainty, but this is just an extra layer.
It's a
of
little
it.
different, yeah.
Yep.
All right, Charles, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this.
It was a pleasure, Mike. Thank you very much for the time today.
Bye-bye.